Now, occasionally you can have a look at a tabloid newspaper who'll tell you that life in British prisons is far too cushy and far too easy. And yet, I'm not sure that's the reality, because we get overnight yet another damning report about a state of a British prison. In this case, it's the Victorian prison in Bedford, and HM Chief Inspector of Prisons said that the conditions there are some of the worst he has ever seen. He said it's a damning indictment of the state of our prisons, and he goes on to talk about, rats, cockroaches, poor washing facilities. I mean, I have to say the whole thing sounds pretty ghastly. Which brings us to a very important debate. What is prison actually for? Well, who better? Who better than Anne Widdecombe, former prisons minister? And this is a really important point, isn't it? We punish people for doing wrong. We put them away to protect the public. And that's the punishment bit, I guess.
Yes, it's what is called retribution and deterrence. Yeah. So it's retribution towards the person and deterrence towards others who might do what he did. But the mission statement of the prison service is divided into two. And the first is to keep people in custody, i.e. not have them escaping all over the place. But the second one, that just doesn't happen on the scale that it should, is that the prison service is supposed to prepare inmates to lead useful and law-abiding lives, both in prison and upon release. Now, a useful life means that you're occupied, that you might be doing work in the prison workshop or in the education department, or you might be attending behaviour courses and all that type of thing, and that is useful. But what actually happens is that as soon as you get any overcrowding in our prisons, which we've got, as soon as you get that, what we call purposeful activity, which is what I've just been talking about, is the first casualty, because all the officers are then so busy upon movements of prisoners that they're not actually able to put the time into the purposeful activity. It's always the first casualty. And there are appalling stories coming out of our prisons at the moment about prison officers having relationships with prisoners and goodness knows what else. And, of course, once that happens, you run the risk of those officers bringing in drugs and et cetera. And I haven't seen our prisons so bad since the early 1990s, when Ken Clarke actually brought in somebody from outside, from the private sector, to try and sort it out. And then after him came Michael Howard, who had a very clear view that we should not just accept that crime was going to happen. And for a while, the prison service actually was humming along and was doing useful stuff. We've
had these problems before. So presumably, if people are not able to engage in purposeful activities, they're then sitting around.
Or lying in bed. I found one prisoner in bed at 11 o'clock in the morning.
Good Lord. Good Lord. And not much chance, then, of them living useful lives when they get out?
No. I mean, unless you can actually... I always used to say that if somebody comes into prison unable to read and write, and 75% of them are actually in a state of illiteracy, 75%.
Huge number.
That if somebody comes into the gates unable to read and write, they should leave the gates able to read and write. I mean, unless they're only there for a fortnight or something, they should leave the gates able to read and write. That, to me, is so basic. It shouldn't even need stating.
And if people aren't learning anything useful in prison and they're lying around, sitting around, time on their hands, the prison conditions are awful. The other big problem with prisons is not just that we're not managing to reform enough people, but the growth of Islamism in our prisons.
Indeed, and of course, the prison service is in a cleft stick. If they separate the Islamists from the rest, then they just egg each other on. But if they mix them in with the rest of the prison population, then they make converts.
That's a very difficult judgment.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult one to call, and I'm not one who sits in judgment on the prison service, because I think it's one heck of a challenge, and they've got to make individual judgments, basically. Bound to get some wrong, bound to.
And I think you visited every prison when you were prison
minister. As then was, yes.
As then was.
Yes.
Obviously the population's bigger, the prison population too is bigger. You've visited prisons in America, you've visited prisons in Australia. This is a subject you've spent a lot of time looking at, understanding. Is there a model out there somewhere? Is there a country out there that maybe gets this right that we could think about copying?
Well, we had, I don't know whether we still have, but we had an industrial prison at Coldingley where every single prisoner got up at 7 o'clock in the morning, went to work, did a whole day in the workshops. And this, Coldingley generally supported the prison service. So they'd be making clothes or they'd be doing laundries or whatever. But a whole day they spent in the prison workshops. And then 5 o'clock at night, they came back. So, you know, we don't actually have to look abroad. We could look at what Coldingley was doing. But if you were looking abroad, then I would say take a look at Germany, where nearly every prison is run like that.
So almost run along military lines?
No, I wouldn't say military lines, though we had a couple of those for young offenders. I wouldn't say military lines. I would say that it is run on how you and I would live our lives. You know, we have an alarm clock. We have to render satisfaction to an employer or we get the sack. And we do this all day, and then we come home in the evening and that time is our own. Now, what we were trying to do in Coldingley successfully was to get prisoners to take that structured lifestyle for granted. Most of these people, Nigel, they've truanted away their education. You know, I used to go into education departments, they'd be doing the adult equivalent of the cat sat on the mat. And I would say, what happened at school? Always. And I wish I had a penny for every time it happened. They would say, didn't go to school, miss. And they've either truanted away or been excluded from their secondary education.
Bedford Prison is being talked about today. We had the escape from Wandsworth that took place a few months ago. A lot of these prisons were literally built in the late 19th century.
Absolutely.
Do we need to knock them down and start again?
We need to do a certain amount of that, yes. I mean, you can't do it wholesale.
No.
But over time, that is exactly what should be happening. And indeed, we have built modern prisons over time. And under successive governments, it's not, you know, one government or the other. We have built modern prisons, but there's still too many prisons of the old estate left. I mean, the worst I saw was Arnley Road in Leeds, when in 1995 or 6, they were only just ending slopping out in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Not the 1890s, Nigel, the 1990s.
Now, a prison service spokesman has said the findings of this inspection are unacceptable, which is why we are taking urgent action to address the concerns raised. I want to have one more question with Anne whilst you're here.
Yeah.
If somebody goes into prison and you say they can't read and write and they've truanted from school and they've probably slipped into crime very early in their lives,
absolutely.
15, 16 or whatever it is, what are the chances of actually turning that person's life around in a good prison?
A, it depends how long we've got them there. B, it depends on the will of the prison staff. And C, on the cooperation of the person. You know, if you can't get the person to see that, you know, they're not going to make anything of their lives if they carry on the way they are, then that doesn't work.
But it can happen.
But it can happen, and it does happen, and the crucial place where it should happen is in our young offenders institutions.
Huge subject. Anne, thank you very much indeed for coming in and joining me